Welcome to the Gastro Girl podcast. We bring together patients, experts, and health advocates who are all here to help you optimize your health. Here's your host, Jacqueline Gaulin.
Hey everyone, welcome to this special edition of the Gastro Girl podcast. This episode is brought to you by Sanofi Regeneron, and today we're with the amazing Beth Rosen, a registered dietitian and GI expert who founded and is the principal of Beth Rosen Nutrition. You can find her at bethrosenrd.com. We are going to talk to you today in relation to the Super Bowl. Doesn't matter what team you're rooting for. We don't want you to let the fear of eating with EoE ruin your Super Bowl party. So Beth, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Thanks. So just before we get started, we're just going to give a little insight on what EoE is, otherwise known as Eosinophilic Esophagitis. So do you want to give us a little download about that?
Sure. And you said it very well, eosinophilic esophagitis.
Took me many times to say that.
Yes, it rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Yeah. So EoE is almost like an allergic response. So it's a response by some antibodies in your esophagus that respond to certain food triggers. And what happens is there's inflammation, and there can be a feeling of an inability to swallow or food getting stuck. It could lead to vomiting and nausea, for some abdominal pain. And then when it goes untreated, what can happen is that inflammation can lead to scarring, which are called strictures, and it can cause a narrowing of the esophagus. So if you suspect you have this, you need to see a gastroenterologist to have it ruled out or tested for it so that you can see whether or not you have it so that you can be treated.
Yeah, and this is really an important point because did you know that there's up to a 10-year delay in diagnosis for people actually getting to a doctor and finding out what's going on? I had a friend of mine who was constantly in and out of the ER. Every time she would eat certain foods, she would get stuck in her throat. And she was never guided to a gastroenterologist for follow-up. And she just had these episodes. And finally, about 2 or 3 years ago, she got the diagnosis of EoE. So we're not trying to scare people, but we want to make you aware, especially as you're enjoying some of your favorite foods at a Super Bowl party, hot dogs, wings, chips, hamburgers, whatever you eat. If stuff is, maybe you take notice there's something stuck in your throat. That's not normal, right, Beth?
So it's not, but these symptoms that I mentioned are common for a number of issues. So if you suspect that, you may have not gotten relief from things that doctors have given you for these symptoms, then make sure you advocate for yourself and go back and ask to have EoE ruled out. Because not that it's a newer diagnosis, it's been around for a while, but it was typically thought that it was only in children, and now we're finding that it can come on later in life. So there will be more folks diagnosed with EoE as time goes on, and the diagnostics are done more frequently.
So as people head into the weekend and their favorite parties with lots of different types of food, let's talk about some of the food triggers for people with EoE. And now, again, we're not saying if you don't have this, you don't need to avoid it, but just we want to raise awareness because you're going to be with lots of different people this weekend. Maybe someone is experiencing this, and knowledge is power. So Beth, tell us, what are some of the foods that maybe trigger this allergic immune response in someone's esophagus?
Mm-hmm. So the foods that are typically the food triggers for people with EoE are the top allergens that we find in the U.S. So dairy, soy, eggs, wheat, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, shellfish. Those are the 8. What we found in recent research is that dairy tends to be the most common trigger for folks with EoE. Now, I want to say that if you do not have EoE, do not cut anything out of your diet. Your doctor is going to want you to be eating all of those foods while you're being diagnosed. And while you're being diagnosed, should you need to go on an elimination diet, it's important that you work with a dietitian who has expertise in GI nutrition so that they can help you through this. But typically where we start to be the least restrictive is by removing dairy. And it's for a short amount of time. It's usually 6 to 8 weeks. But if you're going through that elimination phase during the Super Bowl, you're missing out on nachos and 7-layer dip and pizza. right? These are like the big Super Bowl foods, and wings, because if you're dipping in ranch or blue cheese, that's dairy too, right? So if you or someone is going to be celebrating or watching the Super Bowl together and you want to have some snacks for those folks, you may want to consider some alternatives that wouldn't contain the top 8 allergens so that everyone can enjoy the snacks.
And there are some resources out there, right, Beth, for patients to find recipes and things like that?
Certainly. I mean, if you were to Google eosinophilic esophagitis, first you have to learn how to spell it, but EoE resources, there's a number of them on the website. I believe that we have some education on the GI OnDEMAND and the Gastro Girl websites for eosinophilic esophagitis, right? So they are out there for sure.
Yeah, our friends at AppFed also have a great resource for patients. But let's talk about what happens when someone's at a party or any social situation where food is served, and there may be some coping mechanisms that patients are doing that they don't realize. These are other signs and symptoms, right? Maybe they're taking little bites. Maybe they're avoiding certain foods. If you find yourself drinking lots of liquid with trying to get stuff down, chugging the beer with the pizza, maybe.
Right. It's always important that we chew our food thoroughly and that we drink throughout the day. But if it feels like food is getting stuck frequently, or you're feeling pressure in your chest from food getting stuck, or you're vomiting after meals, right? These are warning signs that you need to go and see a doctor.
Yeah, that's interesting. So vomiting. So if you're at a Super Bowl party and you feel like something's stuck, my friend, she would have to go to the ladies' room and make herself vomit because she felt like something was stuck in her throat.
Right. And we don't want, that's, certainly an alarm feature. We don't want people inducing vomiting for any reason.
No, but this is what, if these are
happening.
Exactly. But these are mechanisms that you should be aware of, what people could be doing, that you may want to guide them to get some help. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah, no, we're not advocating that, but this is something that people may do to cope and deal with it. And it's very scary, extremely scary.
It certainly is, and it's painful. That heartburn feeling may not be your typical reflux feeling after eating those foods. I think a lot of people will feel reflux symptoms after the Super Bowl with the foods we choose. But if you're feeling intense pain or burning, that could be a sign that there's some inflammation happening in your esophagus. So that's another reason to get it checked. Can we say enough? Please go get checked by a gastroenterologist. If you think any of these warning signs sound like something you've experienced.
Because it's not normal. And we have a whole playlist on YouTube and in our podcasts on Apple and other platforms that talk about EoE 101, the basics. We have tons of different information resources out there that can guide you. But at the bottom line, all of the experts say that if you're having difficulty swallowing, it's not normal, and you should definitely seek medical attention to see what's going on. And sometimes things overlap and mirror one another. Again, we're not being alarmist, but there can be up to a 10-year delay again to diagnosis. This is like how difficult it is to get, recognize the signs and symptoms and to get into care. So we really want to bring this to your attention as you embark on your Super Bowl parties this weekend. So Beth, you're so good at this, but what are some tips for enjoying the Super Bowl or any social situation where food is the center of the party and it's served and people may have anxiety about it? What are some tips for us that are worried about that?
Yeah, well, the first tip is to advocate for yourself. Let your host know that you have a food intolerance or a food allergy, and you'll need to make some accommodations, whether that means you're bringing a dish that you can eat or they make changes to what they're serving. Either way, they're going to want you to enjoy the party. So make sure you let them know what you can and cannot eat. Another tip is to make sure that you have something on hand to eat if there isn't anything offered that you can. And there are a couple of food companies that have foods that don't contain the top 8 allergens. So depending on where you are in your elimination diet, there's Enjoy Life Foods has plenty of snacks. There's another one called Made Good. They make snacks with none of the top 8 allergens in them. You can bring trail mix made with like an oat or rice cereal that has seeds and chocolate chips in it. That could be really enjoyable. Dried fruit in it. You can have chips, like corn chips, like tortilla chips, and guacamole. That doesn't typically have any of the top 8 allergens in it. You can ask ahead of time to see labels if your host saved the bags. And you can also ask them to save the bag so that you can read the labels for the ingredients you're trying to avoid.
Oh, those are great tips. So when you work with patients doing these dietary interventions, I know there's treatment options out there for patients with EoE if you happen to be diagnosed or a loved one. So what does a dietary intervention look like if a patient was going to come to you as a dietitian? Like, what would you help me with?
So the first step is usually a one food elimination, and it's typically dairy. And what we do is we remove dairy from your diet. And of course, first you're screened to see if you have an eating disorder, disordered eating, because it's never indicated to do a restrictive diet. Even with EoE, there's medication that can be tried instead. But if we want to determine actually what your food trigger is, we would eliminate it from the diet. And so working together, what we would do is go through the things you like to eat and find alternatives for the dairy you are eating, and also learn how to be a savvy label reader to see where hidden ingredients of dairy might be in something. Like it might say casein or whey, and you might not know that's part of dairy. Those are the proteins in dairy. So we would go through that. And typically what will happen is the person will go for an endoscopy, and there will be biopsies taken to see if there are eosinophils in the esophagus. Then the food is removed for a number of weeks. And then the patient returns back to the gastroenterologist, has another endoscopy and another biopsy to see if the eosinophils are gone. If they are gone, then that food is typically considered the trigger food, and then that food is avoided. And or there are some medications that are out there and some on the horizon that can work in place of restriction. So you may be able to continue to eat that trigger food as long as you're taking medication.
Yeah, and patients, you can find that information in our previous podcast and also resources from AppFed, the American College of Gastroenterology, Gastro Girl, and others that are credible and trusted sources. And we'll put that in a slide for you. I wanted to just bring up this one point because it seems to be popping up more and more of these food allergy tests. Now, we want to be clear that a patient who is having potentially difficulty swallowing, they're not going to find that out by taking one of those tests from home, right? And sending it in. We just want to be clear to patients.
Yes. So eosinophilic esophagitis is an IgE-mediated response. It's an allergy. A lot of those home tests are IgG-mediated responses. And actually, an IgG antibody doesn't actually tell you if you're sensitive to something. It's a memory antibody. It will tell you whether or not you've had it in your lifetime, but it can't tell you whether or not you had a response to it. And while there's a lot of those tests on the market, they're not validated. They haven't been proven in research to be effective. And in fact, they can lead to further restrictive eating and unnecessary restriction of food.
No, I'm glad you provided that insight. And again, patience. The most important thing you can do if you have any sense that you may have EoE or someone you know is to talk to your doctor and get referred to a gastroenterologist sooner rather than later, so you don't have to be struggling with this potentially things getting stuck in your throat for much longer. Really encourage patients to seek care to see what's going on. And we're going to put our other resources out there for you so that you can learn more about EoE, treatment options, and all about the role of a gastroenterologist. So thank you so much, Beth. It's so great to see you, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Gastro Girl podcast. For more information and resources, please visit gastrogirl.com. Do you have a question for Gastro Girl? Please email podcast@gastrogirl.com. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in the Gastro Girl podcast are not a substitute for medical advice from your healthcare professional. Please consult a licensed clinician in your state regarding all matters related to your health.